Hi, everybody. This is Brass Check, and we're having a very important conversation today. As those of you who've been longtime subscribers way back to 1997 know that we've been asking about the Nazification of the American government and what the heck is going on with our government. And we also have been asking about the corruption in the medical industry. Since our very first years that we've published, those were two twin interests of ours. And I've been interested in the medical issues since the 70s when I was part of the first undergraduate program in neuroscience at Princeton. And Princeton is encircled by pharmaceutical companies. And one of our professors, Bart Hobel, who was a great man, he's passed away, gave us a lecture at one point informally. And he said, look, you cannot alter brain chemistry casually. There may be certain extreme conditions where you want to try something, but you better monitor it carefully because this is very serious business. And he impressed that on us deeply. 10 years later, they were giving out psych meds to kids in grammar school like candy. Not his fault. He was a scientist and he didn't go for it. He tried to fight it. He told us to fight it. So anyway, today we're going to talk about COVID in particular, and we're going to get it from a very broad perspective, the historical perspective, and we're going to get it from a very specific perspective, one of the victims of what I call the COVID con. And actually calling it a con is an understatement. It's really the COVID atrocity is really what we should be calling it. Our guests today are Vera Sharav. Welcome, Vera.
Thank you.
And Scott Sharar.
Thanks, Ken.
And Scott is going to be giving us the specific story. It's his daughter, Grace. It's a very important story, and it will bring the things that Vera is going to talk about home. And we're going to get into a lot of details about Grace's story. It's going to be shocking to you. You're going to say such things cannot possibly happen in this world. They certainly can't happen in America. And I'm sorry to tell everybody they can happen, they do happen, and they've been happening all over the world for many decades. And one of the groups that got that started were the Nazis. Vera Sharav is a survivor of the Holocaust. Her family was captured and transported to a concentration camp when she was a small child. She managed to get away a couple of years later. Her mom misrepresented her identity and said she's an orphan. And because she lied to the government, because her mom lied to the government, Vera Sharav is alive. And if she hadn't lied, maybe she wouldn't have made it. Then Vera became actively involved in tracking what was going on with our medical establishment because she too, like Scott, suffered a tragedy in her family at the hands of the pharmaceutical establishment. So Vera, I wonder if you could give us some historical perspective for people that are new to this very concept that medicine could have some problems and could go wrong. Let's talk about the Nuremberg Code, the Holocaust, and what all was involved in the Holocaust, because many people think it was only Jewish people, only, I don't know the polite term, but gypsy people, only political dissidents who were murdered at the hands of the Nazis. But there actually was something that preceded the larger Holocaust. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, the very first medical victims were German. They were German infants and young children under the age of 3. Their crime was that they were disabled in some way. And pretty soon after Hitler took power, he created this. Sorry about that.
Okay.
That's Polly. Sure. Polly, I'll call you back. I'm sorry, I'm on the Zoom now. Okay.
This is the way Zoom is in our new modern.
I was trying to get her earlier, and so now. All right. The point.
So when you say the first medical victims, but actually the first victims total of the Holocaust, the original victims were people with disabilities.
Well, no, you see, this is okay. One of the problems with the term Holocaust, and I've just even now been reading about when it came to be used. That term is new, it's relatively new.
Oh, really?
Yes, there was a scientist, though, who was with the American Army in 1945, and he began referring to the atrocities as a Holocaust. And it's very interesting because it didn't have a prior kind of etiology at all. And somehow he picked it up from somewhere and kept using it as he went from camp to camp. So it's, in other words, now in Hebrew, it's called the Shoah, and the Shoah means a catastrophe. And that's really what we're talking about, the human catastrophe. And in a sense, human made.
Well, I mean, in fact, I think it's very important to say human engineered and human made and human planned. And they
it's
had
totally
all the
a human. It's not nature.
The point I want to make, though, the point I want to make, and I might be wrong about the history, but the actual infrastructure, the systems, the planning, the first victims of that whole larger operation were handicapped people. Is that correct?
Yes, the medical profession actually worked on the protocol, the murderous protocol. And they tried, essentially, they tested it out first on the disabled, whom they wanted to be rid of as an economic burden. They had a lot of propaganda, just as they, caricatured Jews, they did the same with the disabled. And they would show a German having to carry a whole lot of disabled people, and that this is the way they demonized them and sort of tried to normalize medical murder.
So just as they had promotional campaigns to demonize Jewish people, they actually had active promotional campaigns to demonize the disabled.
Yeah, as well. That's right.
A lot of the things, my understanding too, is a lot of the things that they did later on a large scale, like register people, identify who was disabled, and then gather them up in buses. And this, they actually use buses, and then figure out how to kill people rapidly in large numbers. All that was sorted out using disabled people as the guinea pigs.
Yeah, they tested out different methods of murder, different methods of, housing people. They created, essentially, they transformed some 6 hospital centers into murderous killing centers.
Like regional centers.
It's very important to get your head around. It's very difficult, but it's very important to get your head around the fact that medicine can be weaponized when it deviates from the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm to the individual. To the individual. This is terribly important because governments are always telling you, and we're being told now, for the greater good, for the community, save grandma. What kind of nonsense is that? Each person is a person, and each person has a right, to exist, and it shouldn't be up to government bureaucrats to decide who shall live and who shall die.
And that's
exactly what they did.
And that got and well, actually, there's one point I think we all should make, because it's hard to wrap our minds around. It only could happen if doctors and nurses went along with it and executed on the plan. It was the doctors and nurses that actually murdered these people.
Absolutely.
It wasn't jackbooted thugs that came out of a beer hall. It was people that had an MD or were trained in medicine. And we need to, this is a horrible thing to contemplate, but we have to face it if we're going to fight it.
We're still is that both practicing physicians were the killers, but the academics, the medical establishment at universities went along completely with it. There were articles in the journal literature describing some of this, and there were even medical students who came and observed and documented. They wrote down everything as when they were presented with a starved child. One of the things that they tested also was how long the child could survive without nourishment. And a doctor actually lifted what was already a dying child. And the graduate, medical graduate students were writing down exactly how many days, what they got. I mean, this idea of this depersonalization, this dehumanization of the other is what is the most dangerous. When people identify some groups as other, anything goes.
And then there's sort of an institutional inertia that takes place. For example, one of the things that made this possible is that the Nazis took Jewish physicians out of the medical schools, out of the state apparatus dealing with public health. If you were Jewish, you couldn't hold those positions. So who did they replace them with? They literally replaced them with card-carrying Nazi party members. And there's a book by Lipton.
Yeah.
And he says of all the professionals in Nazi Germany, the one that had the highest representation of active card-carrying members was physicians.
Yes.
So then at the end of World War II, there was a trial of some of the doctors, only a tiny fraction, and only a tiny fraction of their crimes. And something came out of that called the Nuremberg Code. Now, you gave a talk in Nuremberg itself on the 75th anniversary. What does the Nuremberg Code say, and what should people be aware of? What's in it?
People need to really, really read it and download it. And as you know, we've created a website where they can download it, because it really is a defense weapon against the abuse of medicine without informed consent. So the first thing, the foremost principle, and there are 10, just like in the 10 Commandments, is the voluntary informed consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. There's no negotiating, no ifs, buts. It is each individual is assured the right to uncoerced, fully informed consent prior to being used in a medical experiment, and by extension to accept medical interventions. People have individual rights to say yes or no to medicine. And the importance of this is that the Nuremberg Code is above national rules that allow these sort of things, okay? And the reason that it was formulated and became part of the decision, the verdict in the doctor's trial, was so that never again would the medical profession cross the barrier against ethical treatment of human beings in medicine. Because that horror, the horror of the medical abuse during the Holocaust, was the most shocking to ordinary people. People are used to armies doing things that aren't always what they're supposed to, if you're supposed to do anything as far as war, but not medicine. They thought medicine, you trust doctors because everyone knows the Hippocratic Oath. Doctors are sworn to do no harm. There's no other profession that swears such a thing. Lawyers, there's no other profession. But here, the doctors breached that universal code, that universal foundational code. So they added to that, to first do no harm, voluntary informed consent. And then they delineated what constitutes permissible research on human beings. Human beings, in other words, they absolutely codified it in this way, are different from animals. You cannot do the kind of research that you may do on animals on human beings. This is a very, very fundamental thing. And I know in the United States, for example, the animal rights movement is much stronger than the human rights movement.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes. Under the federal regulations, animals have more protections.
And you would know that because you are the founder and the director of an organization that studies the rights of human subjects. In fact, and could you tell people the name of your group and the website for people that want to follow it?
The Alliance for Human Research Protection, and the website is ahrp.org.
Great, thank you. So when Vera says that animals have better protection than human beings under our medical system, she's not just pulling that out of her hat. This is the result of decades of study of this matter. Vera, thank you so much for giving us the historical perspective on this, that this kind of abuse has happened in a large scale systematic way. Now we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about an individual case. And Scott Scharer is going to talk about Grace, his daughter. So I wonder, Scott, if you could tell us about Grace, your daughter. What was she like? What did she do? What did she enjoy, have fun at doing? What joy did she bring to other people?
Well, that's the most fun part of talking about the story is about Grace. So Grace was 19 years old when she was murdered. She had Down syndrome. She was extremely high functioning, and what the impact she made on people I could describe it. I'll describe it with an example. So if she met you for the first time, she had a way of making everybody comfortable. So she would say to you, nice to meet you, handsome Ken. And then she would say, would you like to hear my dirty jokes? And you would say, yeah. You would say, well, of course I would like to hear your dirty jokes. And so then she would say to you, well, why didn't the toilet paper cross the road? And you say, I don't know. Why didn't it cross the road? And she'd say, well, because it got stuck in the crack.
Wow.
So remember I said dirty jokes.
Right,
so then she would say, have you read the book Under the Bleachers? And you'd say, no, I haven't read that book. And she'd say, well, do you know who it's written by? You'd say, no. And she'd say, well, it's written by Seymour Butts. So she just had that. So then, she would so she would make people comfortable. So she was a whiz in geography.
Oh.
So she knew every state, every capital, every country in the world, every capital of every country in the world. So I mean, she was way above my level of thinking. So if she would ask you, for example, Ken, do you know what the capital of Wisconsin is? And let's say that you said Bismarck. And of course, it's Madison. But she would never make you feel like you're a dummy. She would say, close. She just always had a complimentary way. I mean, it was quite a gift to have her. We had an angel with us for 19 years, and that's the only way you can look at it. I never miss somebody like I miss her. She could read and write. We homeschooled her. My wife did a great job. She rode a horse by herself. She played violin at my daughter Jessica's wedding. I taught her how to drive a car. And what my favorite thing about her was she got humor. I mean, you see what I'm talking about with her jokes,
Yeah.
but she actually got stuff. She would think through things, and she even came up with her own joke. She deer hunted with me, and in the deer stand, she came up with this joke. She said, Dad, I have a joke. I said, well, what is it? And she said, where do bees go to the bathroom? I said, I don't know. Where do they go to the bathroom? And she says, the BP station. So
Wow.
she was just fantastic. So when we talk about what happened with her, I'm passionate about it. At the beginning, of course, it was all about her. And as I have walked through this and realized she was murdered, and then why did it happen? Met Vera, and Vera's taught me a ton. And then I start piecing this together as to what's going on. Grace would do this when something big happened that was hard to grasp. She would go. So that's what's happening with with me. I mean, it's I have learned Grace died to teach me that I have been programmed, and I don't want to be programmed anymore. So I'm systematically working through asking about everything that I have supposedly learned my whole life, asking the childlike why questions to deprogram myself. So I'll just quickly comment, Ken, about what Vera said, and then you can ask the next question. So, when we look at this business of the individual versus the group, that is a lie. So what is the starting lie with that idea? So individualism versus collectivism. And we have been programmed to believe in collectivism based on the lie of limited resources. Well, so we have 8 billion people on the planet. Every person can fit in the state of Texas and have 1,300 square feet. So, I mean, of course, so it's a lie. So that lie leads to selling the lie of collectivism. Then, with the burden, so the disabled and the elderly are burdens. So that lie has been sold. So we don't have enough money because they're a burden. And in the United States, those two population groups account for 39% of the federal budget through Medicare and Medicaid, so that's another lie. And not the 39%, but the people don't even get the 39%. It's to support a bureaucracy that they've already shown they can print money. So what's the difference what percent of a budget is? They just print money whenever they want. Then, what's happening today, the parallel with the Holocaust is, it's obvious. It's so out there and obvious. But what's happening is that they've had 80 years to perfect something. And I mean, they have got this down. And so what's happening right now, if you watch this worldwide, I have spent several hours over the last 4 days with a lady who's a nurse in the UK. And they are one step ahead of us because we're still hiding this, but it's called euthanasia. And so euthanasia is being desensitized right now worldwide. Look at Canada is encouraging assisted suicide. And the UK has the euthanasia, the medical facilities have to kill 2,000 people a day by government edict in order to break even, because the governments fund the medical facilities. I mean, that's happening here too, but it's all hidden right now. So Grace's story, when you start connecting the dots, you realize, well, she was just one of the first ones that was taken out in the new Holocaust.
Maybe we could get into the details of her story. So we know that she was a happy, functioning, contributing member of your family and of society at large. My understanding is both of you had COVID diagnoses. You went to the hospital, you were separated, and then what happened?
Well, first, I don't know that we had COVID. I mean, so we had a COVID diagnosis, whatever that means. I mean, that's part of this lie. I mean, so I can't tell you if we had COVID or not. But what happened is because we had at least bought into part of the propaganda, and the piece of the propaganda, and this is why I tell people you've got to ask why. So the piece of the propaganda we bought into was from the FLCCC. And so the FLCCC had the COVID protocol. So once we did a home test, Grace had COVID, we started her on ivermectin and vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc. And she was on most of the vitamin protocol beforehand, but then we started ivermectin. Well, the thing in the FLCCC protocol, it says specifically to buy a pulse ox, an oxygen meter for your finger. So now we're monitoring the oxygen. And then it says in the protocol, if the oxygen rate goes below 94, that requires a hospital admission. So we were following a protocol that we trusted. But I'm telling you, if we would not have bought that finger meter, Grace would be alive today.
Oh,
and so
goodness.
The reason I say this isn't because to throw FLCCC under the bus, but you got to be careful. Just because they're a group that we trust doesn't mean you trust them with everything. And I'm going to be very specific on that and give you a situation that I just learned about last week. And so if we would have had an oxygen meter from day one since Grace was born, every time she had a cold or flu and we knew that, now we'd have a baseline. We had no baseline. So now all of a sudden we're just trusting a baseline that somebody else made up without doing any research on our own. So, I mean, Grace is dead because I was programmed to follow. And I'm not putting myself down here, so don't worry about that. But I'm telling the story because I don't want people to be blind. So then just last week, the FLCCC came out with the recommendations for RSV and influenza. And in the recommendations, it says the first step is to get a PCR test. Well, that's insanity. I mean, you're not going to get the PCR test is debunked. So you can see it.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to throw something in about PCR. The inventor of the PCR test, Kary Mullis, was on record that it was never to be used for medical diagnosis. It was a research tool to amplify genetic material to make it easier to do experiments, not on people, but just in the lab. And he said it over and over again. So everybody should know that the man that invented it and knew exactly how it worked said there was no realistic, reliable way to use that test to diagnose anything.
Right.
I just wanted to throw that
Well,
in.
no, it's right on, and I knew that also. That's why I started asking questions about it. And I talked with a doctor, and she agreed with, I'm just a dad, but my assessment was this article is wrong. So we have an organization we trust that is spewing propaganda. So, I didn't research, where the money trail is. Have they been bought? I don't know any of that. All I'm trying to do is say we have to be awake. The only person that can take care of your health is you. And then you branch out from there, but it starts with you. If it doesn't start with you, you are foolish. And that's one reason I keep telling this story over and over and over again, because I don't want people to die. I don't want people to lose their best buddy like I did. And if you rely on the white coat, a lot of them have been bought. Of course, they don't follow the Hippocratic Oath, not all of them, but your due diligence requires you to check this out ahead of time. So what happened to Grace doesn't happen to you or your best buddy.
And even if they haven't been specifically bought, they follow whatever they're told. They're not deep thinkers, a lot of these doctors. I mean, I liken them to clerks at a reception clerk at a hotel where the rooms are really bad, but the lobby looks kind of nice. And the clerk doesn't even know what the rooms are like, but you come in, you give him the money, and he sends you to some terrible room. And he doesn't really know that he's doing that because they're not deep thinkers in my experience with doctors. I'm sure there's exceptions. So, and you're right, it's our health. And sometimes you need a doctor. If you break a leg, you probably don't want to fix that yourself. But going to a hospital is a hazardous.
Hold on, you know what?
Maybe we have to change that too.
I did hear a guy that, I heard of a guy that did fix his own broken leg. He was locally here where we get our steers butchered. We go to an Amish butcher shop, and this man fixed his own leg. He got into the hospital, and the treatment he got, they weren't doing it right. So he went home, had his wife stretch out his leg, and they got it back in place. And he fixed his own broken leg. I'm not recommending that.
Right. Right.
Anyway, you wanted to know about
So you followed advice,
yes,
which we all have to do. If my car has a strange noise and I bring it to the mechanic, I don't know. If I knew what the noise was, I'd fix it myself. I don't know. I go to a mechanic. He's the mechanic. I assume he knows what he's doing and it's not going to exploit me or abuse me. I mean, we know some mechanics do that. And so you just did the normal. Otherwise, we'd go nuts. If everything we did, if we went and bought a tube of toothpaste and had to, I better send it to my own lab to make sure there's no arsenic, we'd lose our minds. So of course we depend on doctors. So you got advice that this oximeter, is that what they call it? The
pulse, pulse oximeter.
And I'll tell you, I mean, this is ironic. I'm just getting over a cold, and I have one of those things. I put it on a couple of days ago. I was down at 93, but then I thought, I've got a cold. Of course I messed up, but you were given instructions that if it hit a certain number that you had to go to the hospital. And people should know that hospitals are not without hazards. Things go wrong in hospitals, even when everybody's well-intentioned. So so Vera, yep.
Can I just say something? The AMA actually came out with a recommendation. This is by now 10, 15 years ago. As the hospital deaths were mounting from, this wasn't at that time yet, they didn't have the killing protocols, but just mistakes. And they advised that everyone who goes into a hospital should have an advocate, a personal advocate. Now that's a big admission that something is very wrong in hospital. So, and this is before COVID, much before.
Thank you. And it just makes sense. It's your loved one who's going to care more than you? And sometimes if you're in a hospital, you're not in a position to make judgments or answer or, figure out what needs to be done. And it's good to have a second person looking at it. So Scott, so you were given advice by people that you trusted. You took a reading. The reading indicated that, well, according to these protocols, I should take Grace to the hospital. You guys went to the hospital. What happened next?
Well, they did a number of tests on Grace. They did a CT scan because she had a blood chemistry called D-dimer that was high, and basically everything came back negative, but she had what they called COVID pneumonia, which is, microclots in your lungs. So they recommended admitting Grace to the hospital for 3-4 days. They said, we'll put her on oxygen and a steroid and she'll be fine, which if they would have done just that, Grace would also be alive today. And so when they said that, I said, well, I'll be staying with her. And that was the first objection. It was my first clue, is they said, well, you can't. I said, what's the reason? And they said, well, because hospital policy with COVID doesn't allow visitors in the room. I said, well, then I'll be taking Grace home. They had a meeting of the higher ups and came back after 2 hours and said, we decided you can stay. So I was with Grace so the emergency room was October 6th until 8 a.m. A nurse came in at 7 a.m. on Sunday, the 10th of October. This is in 2021, and said you need to leave immediately. So I was taken out by an armed guard. And the purpose of taking me out was that I was challenging things. Unfortunately, not at the level I should have, but I was challenging things at a detailed level. So one of the things I challenged was oxygen. So on October 9th, the day before, Grace, I was feeding Grace and the nurse came running in. Of course, Grace could feed herself, but they had a BiPAP mask on her. So I started feeding her and a nurse came running in and said, you can't do that. I said, what's the reason? She said, well, her oxygen saturation is only at 85%. So I thought, well, this cannot be. That's impossible. She's been in the 90s the whole time and just with a regular cannula on. So now they have this BiPAP. She can't be there. So I put my oxygen meter on her finger, which I had in the room because I knew I was going to get COVID. I wanted to monitor myself. Anyway, so I put that on her finger and it read 95%. I called the nurse back in and I said, is my finger meter accurate? She said, yes, it is. I said, well, why is your meter reading 85% when mine reads 95%? And she said, because the leads get sweaty. And so then I said, if that's a known, why don't you proactively change out the leads every 3 or 4 hours or whatever it takes to have an accurate reading, given this is the primary reading you're using to manage my daughter's care? And she shook her finger at me and said, you should just be thankful you caught this. And so there was a number of those things. Feeding Grace in general, I challenged. So the nurses would not allow me to feed her, and they wouldn't feed her. And I said, you can feed her. When the nursing staff would come in and moisten Grace's mouth because the BiPAP dries things out. So they would do this every 3-4 hours. I said, I watched them do this. And what they do is they remove the BiPAP, they put a regular cannula in, and Grace's oxygen is fine. And they said, no, we can't feed her that way. So, well, why not? I said, I watched this when they do this. Well, because the doctor won't allow us to do that. And I said, listen, I am the one who is in charge of my daughter's care, not the doctor. And I believe that was probably the statement that got me taken out. But why should that statement get you taken out? It doesn't, it shouldn't. I was there to advocate. And, so what ended up happening then as we transitioned, so now we had 44 hours without an advocate. We had to hire an attorney to negotiate with the hospital attorney to get my daughter Jessica in as a replacement. My wife Cindy couldn't do it then because she had COVID. So now during that 44 hours where we didn't have advocacy, they increased a dose of a drug called Precedex 7 different times. Precedex is a sedation med. And they started Grace on it on October 9th. And so this is without informed consent. There were things in the hospital that they gave us informed consent with, but there were things that they didn't. And this is one that they didn't. And I think I know why they didn't, because Precedex is what they used to set up Grace's death. And when you hear how she died, you'll see how those dots are connected. So
Scott, I'm sorry to interrupt. So they did not tell you they were giving her that drug. They didn't tell you that they were giving her that particular drug.
And not only that, they didn't tell us what the consequence would be. So go back to the very first day Grace was in there. Another reason I would have been kicked out is because the head doctor on the floor said, we want to try this drug called tocilizumab on Grace. And so he wouldn't tell me anything. So I just said, well, spell it. So I wrote it down. I have my laptop in the room. I started researching tocilizumab. I texted a doctor who I know. She did the same. And in a few hours, we concluded that this drug is no good. The placebo group did better than the test group. So his partner in crime asked me, what is your decision? And I said, we're not doing it and he said, well, what's the reason? I said, well, look at the study from the New England Journal of Medicine. And I showed him, and he got mad at me, started quizzing me about medical facts. And, I'm just a dad. I don't know anything, but I can read a report. So ultimately they have this attitude that, you're just there to hold your daughter's hand. You're not there to challenge things.
Or you're not even there to ask questions. You're not even allowed to ask questions.
So that was the attitude. And, that attitude is really, as I've learned from multiple other cases, now that Grace's case has gone international, people are contacting us all the time. So you hear their stories. Most of them are worse than Grace's story. And you hear the same thing over and over. I mean, you're just a dummy if you ask anything, but in most cases, there's not even an advocate in the room. These people are dying alone. So as we move into Grace's last day on this earth, which was October 13th of 2021, that day started at 8 o'clock in the morning. The doctor called Cindy and I at home. Remember, I'm at home because I'm kicked out. He wants to know, will we give a pre-authorization to put Grace on a ventilator just in case? And so this is the 5th time that they asked us. And I believe because we said no, remember, Grace never needed a ventilator, nor does anybody with COVID need a ventilator. But that's where I didn't know this until after the fact. But I mean, as I researched the money trail, a ventilator is a $300,000 payday for the hospital. So they have a huge incentive to get the patient on a ventilator. So we say no, which I believe we signed her death certificate for that day when we said no. If we would have said yes, Grace would have died 2 to 3 weeks later on a ventilator.
On event,
so they could get their money.
A small thing people don't know about the whole venting process too is the patient is on multiple drips of 24-hour-a-day drugs, including fentanyl often, because they put them on painkillers because it's painful to have that thing down your throat. They put them on paralytics so that they can't move, because if they were to move around, they would, So people might be on anywhere from 5 to 12 different drips of highly toxic drugs for an indefinite period of time. And it also requires a very skilled respiratory respiration tech. I don't know the right term, but there's a profession that specializes in the managing of people who are on vents, and you need a good one. And a lot of these hospitals did not have good ones. So you have the people on the drips. They don't even need to be on this vent in the first place. They're not getting proper supervision. And it was a death sentence for anybody put on it. We have an interview with a nurse who was working in a New York City public hospital, Erin, and I'm so bad with Slavic names, Erin Marie. I'll put the link below. And she talks about pretty, healthy people coming in one door and going out in body bags the other solely because they were put on vents. So let's continue. So they wanted to put her on a vent, and you said,
well, they never said that she needed to be put on a vent, but they were wanting this pre-authorization. So that was an example of somewhat of informed consent. They wanted Cindy, who was the healthcare power of attorney, to approve this. So we didn't for the 5th time. Then he switches gears right after that and says, Grace had such a good day yesterday, which we knew because, she's already been sedated 4 days, but she still had a good day.
And you didn't know, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you didn't know that she was being sedated chemically. right? They
That's
never.
correct. What happened? So remember when we didn't have advocacy for 44 hours, they increased that med 7 different times.
And
When
what,
they would talk,
I'm sorry to interrupt. So literally, so there was a certain level of dose, and then they increased it once, then they increased it twice, then they increased. So that's what you mean when you say they did
seven steps up in the dosage,
wow,
and
over a 48-hour period,
over a 44-hour period. I mean,
44-hour
so
period.
when I look at that, I just look at it as they wanted to sedate her instead of taking care of her. But as I research Precedex, you find out that the purpose of this drug is to set up a ventilator. There's no reason Grace needed to be sedated. That doesn't make any sense. So if they did it for laziness, that's one thing. The room got classified as ICU as soon as she was on Precedex, so they made more money. But the big reason is you have to have the patient sedated. So, I mean, that's why they kept asking us over and over and over. And at one point, the doctor, when I was still in the room with Grace, he said, well, at that point, they told me that the prognosis of a ventilator, when they pestered me the first time, they said the prognosis is only 20% of people walk out alive. And as I drilled that down, I realized that, they gave me a partial truth. But then the doctor said, well, isn't a 20% chance better than no chance? Now, at this point, I was still in the room with Grace, and Grace was doing fine. So you can see what they were trying to set up. So this pestering, your daughter isn't going to make it unless she's vented, is a complete lie. And, if you get told that lie, you should just keep saying no. And as soon as you get told that lie, get your loved one out of the hospital.
I have Scott. I have video in the early days of all this insanity with the news cameras in a hospital, and they recorded a doctor selling a patient on the need to be vented, and they said, "You'll get out of here quicker if we vent you." An absolute lie.
Absolute lie. Yeah. So they lie because, as I look at the doctor who is the one you talk with, his title is hospitalist. And as I look at their job description today in hindsight, they are very personable. They are hired for their personalities, but really what they are is like used car salesmen, and they are very smooth. And, thankfully we said no, and I say thankfully, not because Grace would have died anyway on the ventilator, but this story becomes alive with these details. And, our purpose now has changed. Our purpose before was living out our life, having assets to take care of Grace after we're gone. But, the purpose now is to save other people's lives. So, I mean, this story becomes alive with a lot of these details that, if we weren't tracking them, we weren't there, we wouldn't be able to explain it. Then this ventilator thing is a big detail.
And you've done some discovery and gotten documents from the hospital, and you see it's like a lot of documents, right? It's quite a bit of paperwork, and you see that they were referring to her as the one with the Down syndrome, and they wouldn't. Did they also talk about her vaccination status? I don't remember if that was one of the issues.
Yeah. So I have one of the papers right here, Ken. So the doctor who I mentioned asked me about tocilizumab. He's the COVID expert. His report from the first day that Grace was in the hospital. So what happens is every time a doctor goes in the room, they have to write a report. And so his report from October 7th, the first day, said it referenced that Grace had Down syndrome 4 times, that she wasn't vaccinated twice, that we're Christian twice, and that we're following the frontline doctors' misinformation campaign twice. He wrote specifically that, unfortunately, I think the patient probably would not be here if she had been fully vaccinated. So you can you can obviously see the bias toward Grace. So we have roughly 1,300 pages of records. It's created quite an audit trail for me to be able to put this story together and tell it. So now we're still in Grace's last day. Then he says, Grace had such a good day. We should work on nutrition. So remember, they're working on nutrition. They want to because they wouldn't let us feed her. So we still are trusting the white coat. We have no idea what's going on. We knew Grace had a good day. Jessica told us her oxygen all night long was at 98, 99%. Precedex is designed, one of the side effects of Precedex is hypoxemia, which is low oxygen. So in spite of being sedated for 4 days already, she's still at 98 and 99%. So the doctor said she had such a good day. We should work on nutrition. Let's get her out of bed today. Let's get her sitting in a chair. We got to get things set up so she can go home in 3-4 days. So remember, we had just said no to the ventilator. He immediately switches gears. So we approve a feeding tube. The next thing that happens is Jessica's in the room and she says, she said to the nurse, who happened to have 14 years ICU experience, I'm going to take a shower. The nurse said, you can't take a shower in the room. When I was in the room, I took a shower in the room. She said, you can't take a shower here. Jessica said, what's the reason? You let my dad do it. She said, I don't care what we did for your dad. You can't do it. Jessica's a little bit fearful of being kicked out. So she asked Grace if it was okay if she goes home for an hour. Grace acknowledges it. When she got back an hour later, she overheard the hospitalist, another doctor, and the 14-year ICU experienced nurse in the hallway say the family's not going to like this. So remember, just an hour earlier, the doctor said how great of a day Grace had. So he says, she said, what isn't the family going to like? And they said, well, we had to restrain Grace while you were gone. They strapped her down the bed because she wanted to get out of bed to go to the bathroom. So they made her go to the bathroom in the bed. They used that as an excuse to increase Precedex to now 14 times the dose they started around 4.5 days earlier. 10:48 in the morning, she's now at 14 times that dose. 8 minutes later at 10:56, the doctor put an illegal do not resuscitate order on Grace. And this is maybe the biggest takeaway. People do not realize these doctors are doing this. So why are they doing it? They think they have immunity from liability under the PrEP Act. Putting DNRs on people like that is illegal. But
Right.
many I just talked with a man whose wife was killed in Green Bay on Monday. He called, he got my number, got a hold of me, and he wanted to tell me about this situation with his wife. She was in the hospital for cancer. They overdosed her on the chemotherapy drug, and the doctor put an illegal DNR on her, and she was killed.
Wow.
So this is more common than people think. A man from church told me that when he went into the hospital for COVID, they made him, as a condition of entering the hospital, sign a DNR order on himself.
Really?
Yes. So this is happening. This is not, Grace's case is not a one-off. This is happening. So now we just keep going into the timeline. At 11:25, they gave her lorazepam. This is on top of the Precedex she's on. At 11:37, they put the feeding tube in. They didn't start feeding her until 1:59 in the afternoon, over 2 hours later. At this point, Grace was knocked out. At 5:46, they gave her another dose of lorazepam, 5:49, another dose, and at 6:15, a 2 milligram dose of morphine as an IV push. So in 29 minutes, she had those 3 meds, and that's the second cause of death. The first cause of death was, on her death certificate, says acute respiratory failure, which was caused by Precedex. If you look at the Precedex package insert, it says if you use it for more than 24 hours, it causes acute respiratory failure. So that was a direct cause of death, and it's true. The second cause of death says COVID-19 pneumonia. That's because there's a $13,000 death benefit for the hospital if they have that listed. Well, that's not true. The med combination was the second cause of death. And then the third cause of death was the illegal DNR, which we had no idea was there. At 7:20, Jessica called us on a FaceTime call, panicking. Remember, 6:15 was the morphine. So in 29 minutes, those meds, if you're not familiar with them, if you are in hospice care, the last day of your life, that is what they give you to take you out. Those 3 med combinations. So that's what took Grace out. That's when I concluded Grace was murdered, as I went through the records and saw the hoops they had to jump through to get those meds into my daughter. It isn't just automatic.
Now, Scott, there's another piece to this. You've done research and you showed a chart at one point that showed the outscaled percentage of disabled people who died during the COVID situation. And it's to talk about those numbers, how you were much more likely to die if you had some kind of disability. Now, that makes no medical or scientific sense. Why, if someone has Down syndrome, are they suddenly, 4 times or 10 times more likely to die of something? Can you talk
Right.
about
So
that?
the number one and number two causes of death with COVID in a hospital in the United States, number one is elderly, number two is disabled. Well, those are not comorbidities. Those are just statistical facts. So Grace was no more likely to die of COVID than I was or you were or anybody was. There's no reason for it. So, but they, in the propaganda at the beginning, you remember they said the elderly are the most at risk. Grace was on Medicaid, so we got a letter from Medicaid. You can be first in line for the jab because the disabled are at risk. So they spread this propaganda, which, so then, of course, the numbers hit the propaganda by design. And disabled females, one of the articles that I drilled down in June showed that disabled females were 11 times more likely to die of COVID in a hospital than non-disabled females, which, I mean, that makes absolutely zero sense.
And the disability could be something like Down syndrome. And it sounds like Grace was healthy as a horse otherwise in her normal life, right? It sounds like it to me.
Absolutely. Yeah, she
Yeah.
was.
So she had a condition, but it had nothing to do with her respiratory health.
Correct.
But they tried to paint her with that brush. Oh, well, she's disabled, so she's already weakened, and therefore she's going to be a victim of COVID. So do you happen to have the numbers offhand of the percentages of so-called disabled people versus average people who were reported to have died of COVID?
I don't have that at my fingertips because I shut down, I can grab it off of my laptop if you need it, but I don't have that at my fingertips. It's just the article that I remember when I studied this was the one that was most shocking, that it was literally 11 times more or the statistics were disabled females died at an 11 times greater rate than non-disabled females.
Right, and disabled could mean Down syndrome. It could mean maybe they had been in an accident at one point and couldn't walk. I mean, there's a lot of disabilities.
It could be anything. It could be autism. It could be cleft palate. It could be great.
So you have a video about that, a short video.
Yes.
And we'll run that. We'll tack that onto this later. Okay. So we're coming up on our hour. So thank you, Scott, for sharing this story.
Boy, this went by fast.
Yeah. So we've got the historical perspective that this really is a thing, that it happened in Germany on a mass scale. And now I think anybody that's watched the entire COVID carnival knows that there were many, many things going wrong with it. And now we're getting a firsthand account of somebody who's got a reason to pay attention to it very closely. And then you've also met, Scott, hundreds of people, I would assume at this point, who've been through something similar. They've contacted you and told you their stories. And I don't know if it's hundreds of scores.
It's probably well over 1,000 now.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
One I want to emphasize, because I explained that Grace was taken out by the end of life meds that you use in hospice care. But there's a lady whose 1-year anniversary was on December 9th for her death. She also had Down syndrome. Her mom contacted us after she heard the story and provided me the medical records, and specifically the billing records. And she was taken out by fentanyl, midazolam, and zirconium bromide. So if you don't know what those are, look them up. Those 3 meds are exactly the combination that are used to take out inmates on death row.
Oh my goodness.
It is so sick. Vera, go ahead.
Yeah, Vera. And so Vera, you've been studying these things for decades.
Okay, I want to not talk about the Holocaust, but to show how it's connected. And that is, now, do we all remember when Senator Grassley brought to light that in hospitals they have death squads?
No.
Yeah. Well, at the time, it did hit the media and all that, and oh, no, we won't have that. Okay, and everybody thought that's the end of it. Well, it's not. It was put into law. It's part of Obamacare. The protocols now, what they've done is they have for a while now, for a couple of decades, but it's really it's almost like they got ready for COVID, because COVID gave the opportunity in a massive way to implement the idea that one size fits all, one medical intervention is given to everyone with this condition. So with COVID, that's exactly what they did. The ventilators, the fact that they were killing 80% in New York City who were on ventilators didn't stop them from using them. They continued, and they're still being used. So we have to understand this goes back. These are guidelines, and they're coming from the feds, and they're tied to the money. You follow those guidelines, you make a lot of money.
Yep.
You don't follow it, we throw you out under the bus. The guidelines now are not meant to save lives, but rather to eliminate lives. I know this is very hard for people to digest, but this is the fact.
That's right.
The fact is that all those elderly who were murdered a year earlier in March and April of 2020, we haven't had any prosecutions. Why? And that had nothing to do with the PrEP Act either, because at that time it was not the jabs and it was not remdesivir yet. They hadn't had that. But they were murdering people in hospitals, and nobody has been held accountable. That's what people need to ask. Why?
And when we say murdering them, Scott has explained exactly how they did it. They didn't put a gun to their head. They used medical procedures and drugs, approved drugs, and they just cranked them and cranked them and cranked them until the person died, which was predictable. So when we say murder, that's what we mean.
Right.
Premeditated murder. Let's put the full name to it. This was premeditated murder. Yeah.
Systematic, planned out.
And we really, people haven't taken seriously those who have been talking for decades about population control. What that actually means is population reduction through medicine, not armies. You don't need armies for this. You've got hospitals now.
And there is the precedent of Nazi Germany. So if people say, oh, something like that could never happen, it has happened. And there's plenty of evidence that it's happening right now. So Scott and Vera, thank you very much for sharing this. This is not, easy stuff to look at, but we've got to look at it and we've got to talk about it. And I thank you both for being on the front line of talking about this and spreading the word so that people are aware.
Thank you for having us. I hope we can save some lives simply by people saying no to orders.
I'm on the same page. Thank you very much, Ken. I would say even before people say no, they have to change their belief. Because if you don't believe what we're saying, it takes a lot to change your belief. And once you do, it changes everything. If you think the medical system is not following the Hippocratic Oath, just think of what that does to your life. Most people still don't believe the story. Grace's story, of course, they don't believe it's the second Holocaust, but so to say no, the first step is you have to believe what we're talking about. And if you do, great. If you don't, I would encourage you look up some of these facts. People can get a hold of me directly via Grace's website. I'm glad to talk through things. If we can convince one person at a time, I'll do it. I'm working on this every waking moment.
And what's your website, Scott?
It's ouramazinggrace.net.
Great. Ouramazinggrace.net. And they can get the detailed information on Grace's case, but also the larger picture of what's happening all over the country. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Vera. Thank you for this.
You're welcome, Ken.
Brass Check TV, free to you, not free to us. We've got a server bill, we've got an email software bill, we've got a tech helper bill, and that happens every month. So to everybody that is supporting us financially, that's paying for their subscription in one way or another, we really appreciate it. If you're not, consider doing so. Everybody's got money for the newspaper and the cable bill and all that. Do you have money for media that's actually serving you? That's really the issue here. And when you help us, it allows us to get this information out to the world. So thanks to all our supporters, and if you're not a supporter already, please consider becoming one.